Okay, 14.1, we're going to split up into two sections, A and B. A is where it's very step by step by step, it's very spread out. And then B is just lots of practice going from the equation. So with 14.1, we're looking at matrices, and sometimes they'll be written already for you, sometimes you need to write them. So if you have an equation where it has a system of equations like 2x minus 3y equals 5 and 4x plus y equals 2, this is your first column of your matrix, this is your second, and I put a little one there, and this is my third, and you put a bar in between. So that would actually be what my matrix would look like. And you can put zeros for placeholders. So that's what the problems are going to look like. Now our goal here is to get a problem where this bar, everything on the left, has ones across the diagonal and zeros everywhere else. And then our answers would be here. Whatever three numbers are there are x, y, and z, or if you have two answers, it's x and y. So the operations you can perform are multiplying. You can multiply a row by a constant. So like here, I'm multiplying row 2 by -3. And when you do that, it's when you're trying to get a 1. So anytime you're getting that diagonal, that's when you do that multiplying. So this is going to be multiplying the rows. Anytime you're getting zeros, you're trying to add rows together. So for example, if I want to get row 1 to have a 0 spot, I'm going to use whatever row in that column has a 1 placeholder. And I'll show you what that means. So anytime you're trying to get these zeros underneath or in that same column, go back to the row that has the 1 in it and use it. The last thing is sometimes it's easier to just switch two rows. It saves you a step if you already have a 1 in the right spot. So you can always just switch two rows. You just have to switch every spot. So that's kind of how the order of things to go in. If you need to look back at these, that's helpful. So what we're going to do right now is go through a problem on the homework from 14.1a, and then there's going to be a separate video for some examples on 14.1b, because all of that next page is 14.1b. So taking a look here, this one here, we're actually going to look at number 6 first. Let's do number 3. So for number 3, if you take a look, and we'll come back to the other ones, all you're doing is making a matrix, and this is going to have 2 rows. So this is my first column here, and there's a 1 in front, 1 and 4. This next one, 3 and -2, and the last 23 and -6. And if there's no number, if this was just like that, you still put a 0 there. It needs a placeholder. So that's how you do writing them. Now to actually do stuff to them, we're just going to look at a couple of these operations here. So like this one here, we're going to look back at this problem, and we're just going to switch row 1, which is right here, and row 3. They're just switching spots. And then the middle did not change because it doesn't tell us anything about row 2. Now from here, this is now our new equation. I'm going to not look at this guy anymore. He's gone. Now our new equation is R2 plus R3. So the only row that's changing is R2. So I'm just going to copy row 1 over. Okay, and then row 2 is adding rows 2 and 3 together, each spot. So row 2 and row 3 make 0 there. Those make 0 there. Those make -1 there. And those make 0 there. And now, completely ignore that. We're just going to look at these ones now. We're going to switch row 2 and 3 according to this next operation. So row 1 is not changing. So I always write the row that doesn't change first. And then switch these. And the reason we switched them here is because look at all the zeros we have. We want that 1 to be on the nice diagonal right there. Okay, and then you just keep going. Let's do one last one here of an example, and then it should be pretty easy to follow. So now, the only thing that's changing is row 2, so I'm going to copy 1 and 3 over. And then I'm going to be taking row 2 and adding 3 of row 1. So I'm going to do this plus 3 of row 1. Well, let me zoom in there. Okay, plus 3 of row 1. Notice I took the spot right on row 1. I'm not going to use the same number in all of these. I'm going to use whatever's on top there. So negative 3 plus 3, the first spot gets you a 0. 2 plus 6 gets you an 8. 2 plus 0 makes a 2. 16 plus 0 makes a 16. And the reason we did that was so that that first spot became a 0. So now this row is completely done, and then we're going to move on from there, but all the operations you should have already done, so you should know. Now the last example I want to go through, we'll probably do a little bit of both of these. So this one here, problem number 1, so we're kind of going in a weird order. Problem number 1, we're trying to get 1s all the way across and 0s in all of these spots. And the order you go in usually is this one and then 0s. Then you find this one and then 0s. And then this one and then 0s. But the order on here is kind of weird. Just a heads up. So I'm just looking at how did I get to my next matrix? What row is changing? Row 1's good, row 2's good, row 3 is the only one that changed. So I'm going to definitely say row 3 changed. And it's going to a 0, so I know there's going to be adding or subtracting. So if I have a 1 here, I have to get rid of a 1. So row 3 minus 1 to get a 0. And then you always put the row that has the 1 in the column there. So you're going to do that to all of those. You should get the same answer. Now the next time I'm changing, if you look, again, row 3 is changing. And it's changing the 4 to a 1. If the first number doesn't change, go to the next one. And if it's going to a 1, remember it's multiplying, and we're taking a 4th of row 3. Okay, now that should give us a 1 there. Now the next one that changes is to go from this row to this row. And notice the 1 stayed the same, but this changed to a 0. So that's when I say, okay, row 1 changed, but I need to add or subtract something to it. So I'm going to add 2, and I'm going to use row 3 because that's where my 1 is. Okay, now the next one that changes is to go from row 2 here to this row 2. So I know row 2 is changing, and the 4 is going to a 0. So I know that it's going to be subtracting 4. Remember, adding and subtracting are when you go to 0. And I use row 1 here because that's where my 1 spot is in that column. Okay, on the next one, to go from this one to this one, we're going to take row 2 and do something to it. And if you notice, 0 stayed the same, 0. Negative 6 was the first number to change, and it's going to a 1. So I know I'm going to multiply or divide there. So remember, anytime it goes to a 1, it's multiplying or dividing. Okay. This one here, the first row is changing, and it's going from a 1 to a 0. So I'm going to take away 1. And in that column, this is the one I use. Oh my goodness, and that's not row 3. That is row 1. That's an error on my part. Okay, there we go. And the last one. Let's see. This row and this row are both changing, so they're switching spots. It's the only way you can switch both rows at once. And then you're done. So the next example here is you are figuring out, okay, what should I do first? So on this one, I'll just give you a hint. You want to get this to be a 1. Okay. So you're going to be multiplying something. This is a third of row 1. So you're going to divide each of these by 1. Just that top row, sorry. And then the rest don't change. Sorry, I should have written those first. And then your next step would be, okay, I have a 1 here. We're good. Next step would be to get this to be a 0. So anytime it's going to a 0, you subtract. So row 2 minus 1 of row 1. And that will give you row 2. So I would go in here and subtract 1 of row 1 every time. Minus 1 of row 1, minus 1 of row 1, minus 1 of row 1. And that will give you, well, the first row doesn't change, the last row doesn't change, but that middle, 1 minus 1 is 0, 2 minus 0 is 2, 3 minus 1 is 2, 28 minus 8 is 20, and from there, you're just trying to get now this spot to be a 1, and you keep going, and follow that pattern that's in your notes.